The Seminole are a Native American tribe originally from Florida. They comprise 3 federally recognized tribes and independent groups, most living in Oklahoma with a minority in Florida. The Seminole Nation emerged in a process of ethnogenesis out of groups of Native Americans, most significantly Creek from what are now northern Muskogee. The word Seminole is a corruption of Cimarron, a Spanish term for runaway or wild one. During their early decades, the Seminole became increasingly independent of other Creek groups and established their own identity. They developed a thriving trade network during the British and Second Spanish periods. The tribe expanded considerably during this time, and was further supplemented from the late 18th century by free black people and escaped enslaved people who settled near and paid tribute to Seminole towns. The latter became known as Black Seminoles, although they kept their own Gullah culture of the Low Country. They developed the Afro-Seminole Creole language, which they spoke through the 19th century after the move to Indian Territory. Seminole culture is largely derived from that of the Creek. The most important ceremony is the green corn dance. Other notable traditions include use of the black drink and ritual tobacco. As the Seminole adapted to Florida environs, they developed local traditions, such as the construction of open-air, thatched roof houses known as chickees. Historically, the Seminole spoke Miccosukee and Creek, both Muskogean languages. After the independent United States acquired Florida from Spain in 1819, its settlers increased pressure on Seminole lands. During the period of the Seminole Wars, the tribe was first confined to a large reservation in the center of the Florida peninsula by the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, and then evicted from the territory altogether according to the Treaty of Payne's Landing. By 1842, most Seminoles and Black Seminoles had been coerced or forced to move to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River. During the American Civil War, most of the Oklahoma Seminole allied with the Confederacy, after which they had to sign a new treaty with the U.S., including freedom and tribal membership for the Black Seminole. Today, residents of the reservation are enrolled in the federally recognized Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, while others belong to unorganized groups. Perhaps fewer than 200 Seminoles remained in Florida after the Third Seminole War, but they fostered a resurgence in traditional customs and a culture of staunch independence. In the late 19th century, the Florida Seminole re-established limited relations with the U.S. government and in 1930 received 5,000 acres of reservation lands. Few Seminole moved to reservations until the 1940s. They reorganized their government and received federal recognition in 1957 as the Seminole Tribe of Florida. The more traditional people near the Tamiami Trail received federal recognition as the Miccosukee Tribe in 1962. The Oklahoma and Florida Seminole filed land claim suits in the 1950s, which were combined in the government settlement of 1976. The tribes and traditionals took until 1990 to negotiate an agreement as to division of the settlement, a judgment trust against which members can draw for education and other benefits. The Florida Seminole founded a high-stakes bingo game on their reservation in the late 1970s, winning court challenges to initiate Indian gaming, which many tribes have adopted to generate revenues for welfare, education and development. Etymology. The word Seminole is derived from Cimarron, a Spanish term for runaway or wild one, historically used for certain Native American groups in Florida. The people who constituted the nucleus of this Florida group either chose to leave their tribe or were banished. At one time the terms renegade and outcast were used to describe this status, but the terms have fallen into disuse because of a negative connotation. They identify as Yat Seminole or free people, because for centuries their ancestors had resisted Spanish efforts to conquer and convert them, as well as English efforts to take their lands and use them in their wars. They never signed a peace treaty with the United States. History. Native American refugees from northern wars, such as the Yuchi and Yamasee after the Yamasee War in South Carolina, migrated into Florida in the early 18th century. More arrived in the second half of the 18th century, as the Lower Creeks, part of the Muskogee people, began to migrate from several of their towns into Florida to evade the dominance of the Upper Creeks and pressure of colonists. They spoke primarily Hitchiti, of which Miccosukee is a dialect, which is the primary traditional language spoken today by Miccosukee in Florida. They displaced the Calusa and Mayaimi tribes with the aid of the Spanish, who moved many of the smaller tribes to Cuba when they withdrew after ceding Florida to the British in 1763, following the French and Indian War. In Cuba, the Florida tribes suffered high mortality due to disease. In Florida, the Creeks had earlier intermingled with the Choctaw and other few remaining indigenous people. In a process of ethnogenesis, the Native Americans formed a new culture which they called Seminole, a derivative of the MV's Coke word Seminole, an adaptation of the Spanish Cimarron, which means wild or runaway men. The Seminole were a heterogeneous tribe made up of mostly Lower Creeks from Georgia, who by the time of the Creek Wars numbered about 4,000 in Florida. At that time, numerous refugees of the Red Sticks migrated south, adding about 2,000 people to the population. They were Creek-speaking Muskogee, and were the ancestors of most of the later Creek-speaking Seminole. In addition, a few hundred escaped African American slaves had settled near the Seminole towns and, to a lesser extent, Native Americans from other tribes, and some white Americans. The unified Seminole spoke two languages, Creek and Miccosukee, two among the Muskogean languages family. Creek became the dominant language for political and social discourse, so Miccosukee speakers learned it if participating in high-level negotiations. During the colonial years, the Seminole were on good terms with both the Spanish and the British. In 1784, after the American Revolutionary War, Britain came to a settlement with Spain and transferred East and West Florida to it. The Spanish Empire's decline enabled the Seminole to settle more deeply into Florida. They were led by a dynasty of chiefs of the Alachua chiefdom, founded in eastern Florida in the 18th century by Cowkeeper. Beginning in 1825, Mike Canopy was the principal chief of the unified Seminole, until his death in 1849, after removal to Indian Territory. This chiefly dynasty lasted past removal, when the U.S. forced the majority of Seminole to move from Florida to the Indian Territory after the Second Seminole War. Mike Canopy's sister's son, John Jumper, succeeded him in 1849, and after his death in 1853, his brother Jim Jumper became principal chief. He was in power through the American Civil War, after which the U.S. government began to interfere with tribal government, supporting its own candidate for chief. Political and social organization. The Seminole were organized around Atalwa, the basis of their social, political and ritual systems, and roughly equivalent to towns or bands in English. Membership was matrilineal, but males held the leading political and social positions. Each Atalwa had civil, military and religious leaders. They were self-governing throughout the 19th century, but would cooperate for mutual defense. The Atalwa continued to be the basis of Seminole society in the West into the 21st century. Seminole Wars. After attacks by Spanish settlers on Native American towns, natives began raiding Georgia settlements, purportedly at the behest of the Spanish. In the early 19th century, the U.S. Army made increasingly frequent incursions into Spanish territory to recapture escaped slaves. General Andrew Jackson's 1817–1818 campaign against the Seminole became known as the First Seminole War. Following the war, the United States effectively controlled East Florida. In 1819, the United States and Spain signed the Adams-Onis Treaty, which took effect in 1821. According to its terms, the United States acquired Florida and, in exchange, renounced all claims to Texas. Andrew Jackson was named military governor of Florida. As European American settlement increased after the treaty, settlers pressured the federal government to remove the Native Americans from Florida. Slaveholders resented that tribes harbored runaway black slaves, and more settlers wanted access to the desirable lands held by Native Americans. Georgian slaveholders wanted the Maroons, and fugitive slaves living among the Seminoles, known today as Black Seminoles, returned to slavery. After acquisition by the U.S. of Florida in 1821, many American slaves and Black Seminoles frequently escaped from Cape Florida to the British colony of the Bahamas, settling mostly on Andros Island. Contemporary accounts noted a group of 120 migrating in 1821, and a much larger group of 300 African American slaves escaping in 1823, picked up by Bahamians in 27 sloops and also by canoes. They developed a village known as Red Bays on Andros. Federal construction and staffing of the Cape Florida Lighthouse in 1825 reduced the number of slave escapes from this site. Cape Florida and Red Bays are sites on the National Underground Railroad network to Freedom Trail. Under settlement pressure, the U.S. government made the 1823 Treaty of Camp Moultrie with the Seminole, seizing 24 million acres in northern Florida and offering them a reservation in the Everglades of about 100,000 acres. They and the Black Seminoles moved into central and southern Florida. In 1832, the United States government signed the Treaty of Payne's Landing with a few of the Seminole chiefs. They promised lands west of the Mississippi River if the chiefs agreed to leave Florida voluntarily with their people. The Seminoles, who remained prepared for war, white settlers continued to press for their removal. In 1835, the U.S. Army arrived to enforce the treaty. The Seminole leader Osceola led the vastly outnumbered resistance during the Second Seminole War. Drawing on a population of about 4,000 Seminole and 800 allied Black Seminoles, he mustered at most 1,400 warriors. They counted combined U.S. Army and militia forces that ranged from 6,000 troops at the outset to 9,000 at the peak of deployment in 1837. To survive, the Seminole allies employed guerrilla tactics with devastating effect against U.S. forces, as they knew how to move within the Everglades and use this area for their protection. Osceola was arrested when he came under a flag of truce to negotiations with the U.S. in 1837. He died in jail less than a year later. His body was buried without his head, which was preserved. Other war chiefs, such as Halleck Tusanuggee and John Jumper, and the Black Seminoles Abraham and John Horse, continued the Seminole resistance against the Army. After a full decade of fighting, the war ended in 1842. Scholars estimate the U.S. government spent about $40 million on the war, at the time a huge sum. An estimated 3,000 Seminole and 800 Black Seminole were forcibly exiled to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi, where they were settled on the Creek Reservation. A few hundred survivors retreated into the Everglades. In the end, after the Third Seminole War, the government gave up trying to subjugate the Seminole and left the estimated fewer than 500 survivors in peace. The Seminoles are the only tribe in America to have never signed a peace treaty with the U.S. government. Languages. Historically, the various groups of Seminoles spoke two mutually unintelligible Muskogee languages, Miccosukee and Creek. Miccosukee is now restricted to Florida, where it was the native language of 1,600 people as of 2000. The Seminole Nation of Oklahoma is working to revive the use of Creek, which was the dominant language of politics and social discourse among its people. Creek is spoken by some Oklahoma Seminole and about 200 older Florida Seminole. Today, English is the predominant language among both Oklahoma and Florida Seminole, particularly the younger generations. Most Miccosukee speakers are bilingual. Contemporary During the Seminole Wars, the Seminole people began to separate due to the conflict and differences in ideology. The Seminole population had also been growing significantly, though it was diminished by the wars. With the division of the Seminole population between Oklahoma and Florida, some traditions such as powwow trails and ceremonies were maintained among them. In general, the cultures grew apart and had little contact for a century. The Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, and the Seminole Tribe of Florida and Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida, described below, are federally recognized, independent nations that operate in their own spheres. Religion: Seminole tribes generally follow Christianity, both Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, and their traditional native religion, which is expressed through the stomp dance and the green corn ceremony held at their ceremonial grounds. Indigenous peoples have practiced green corn rituals for centuries. Contemporary southeastern Native American tribes, such as the Seminole and Muskogee Creek, still practice these ceremonies. As converted Christian Seminole established their own churches, they incorporated their traditions, as Christianity is a syncretic religion, able to absorb other influences. Seminole Christian churches often sing hymns in their traditional languages. In the 1950s, federal projects in Florida encouraged the tribe's reorganization. They created organizations within tribal governance to promote modernization. As Christian pastors began preaching on reservations, green corn ceremony attendance decreased. This created tension between religiously traditional Seminole and those who began adopting Christianity. In the 1960s and 1970s, some tribal members on reservations, such as the Brighton Seminole Indian Reservation in Florida, viewed organized Christianity as a threat to their traditions. By the 1980s, Seminole communities were concerned about loss of language and tradition. Many tribal members began to revive the observance of traditional green corn dance ceremonies, and some moved away from Christianity observance. By 2000, religious tension between green corn dance attendees and Christians decreased. Some Seminole families participate in both religions. These practitioners have developed a Christianity that has absorbed some tribal traditions.